Hello, everybody, and welcome to this podcast with myself, Matthew Parry, and my colleague at the Hilary Rodham Clinton School of Law and Criminology, Victoria Silverwood. We're here today to talk about an area of law and criminology that interests both of us and was the main topic of Victoria's PhD, which she's completed, and is the main topic of my PhD, which I haven't yet completed, but I'm in the process of finishing. So before we get into the subject matter, let's just do some quick introductions. So Victoria, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yes, so I'm Victoria Silverwood. I used to initially, I did an undergraduate degree with sociology and criminal justice before the first criminology degrees, and then worked briefly in criminal law before retraining in academia, doing a master's in criminology, followed by my PhD. I'm working at the Hilary Rodham Clinton School of Law as a lecturer in criminology, and I've worked in several other universities locally doing very similar role. My kind of topics of interest particularly are sports and the use of violence, as well as qualitative research, so getting to know people, getting to understand people's opinions. And I also lecture on penology, which is a study of prisons and punishment, and also the use of volunteers within the criminal justice system.
Fantastic. And as I said, my name's Matthew, and I'm in the law part of the the Department of Law and Criminology at Swansea. So my main area of interest is sports law, contract law, and land law, as well as developing students' skills in practical subjects. And that is the crossover that you might have picked up between Victoria and my research interests, which is sports and sports-related events. And both of us in our research have done work on one particular area, which is concussion within sports. But before we move on to talk about our individual approach to concussion, something you might be asking is, why the two different perspectives? It's one topic, concussion in sports. So why are we coming at it from two different approaches? And that's a really interesting question, because a lot of what you will look at in life and in law and in criminology can be looked at from different perspectives. And one example that I often give here is the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. Depending on where you're coming from, you will look at that bridge in two different ways. An engineer might look at it and say it's a very sound structure that has stood the test of time, and be able to look at all the reasons why it has stood there and why it will not give way in the future. I, not coming from an engineering background, would probably look at it and say that's a beautiful bridge. It is artistic. I could paint a picture of that. So in that context, you've got one bridge. Somebody's looking at it from an engineering perspective. Somebody's looking at it from an artistic perspective. That's exactly the same here. And one of the degrees you can study at Swansea is law with criminology, which means that you'll be looking at subjects from dual perspectives, from the law perspective and from criminology perspective. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to give you two different perspectives of concussion in sport. Victoria is going to talk about it now from a criminology perspective, and then I'm going to talk a little about it from a law perspective. And hopefully you'll get an idea by the end of this podcast about the different ways you can look at the same topic. So Victoria, would you like to tell us a little bit about concussion in sports from a criminology perspective?
Yes, yeah. The best way for me to start, I suppose, is to explain really how I got into all this, researching this particular area, because when I started doing this, there was very little research criminologically on sports. And my interest came from watching ice hockey games where it was allowed for there to be a bare knuckle fist fight as part of the game, when you're not allowed to engage in a bare knuckle fist fight in any other sport, or indeed like in the public as well. So I was really interested to see what other academics had said about this kind of legitimization of violence on that basis, and started researching it for my PhD. So I did what's called an ethnography for my PhD, which is a kind of in-depth qualitative piece of research. And in doing that, I spent a year alongside a professional ice hockey team. So I was on the bench with the players during games, in the locker room, getting to know them in the rink and outside of the rink, and spent an entire sort of hockey season with this professional team. And these kind of research methods, these sort of ethnographic and qualitative methods, allow you to really understand things from somebody else's point of view. So I'm not asking them a survey, which might give me a limited range of answers. I'm asking them to talk to me about their life and to try and explain it to me so that I can understand it a little bit better. So initially, my research was focused very much on the use of violence and the legitimization of violence, meaning how they explain their use of violence on the ice when they wouldn't engage with a bare knuckle fist fight away from the ice. So it kind of started on that basis, but really it was quite an interesting time because I've been researching this for 11 years now. And during that time, one of the biggest changes has been an awareness of concussion and head injuries. And that's had a massive impact on violence within the sport of ice hockey. And it's been very much, having all sports a lot more aware of concussion. Scientists are as well are a lot more aware of the different reactions that people have to concussion and some of the problems with head injuries. So it's been really interesting to sort of come at it from a social and cultural criminological background rather than from any other background. And if I can kind of return to the analogy that Matthew made earlier about the Golden Gate Bridge, when he said that, I initially thought he was going to say, by the time you finish painting the Golden Gate Bridge, you've got to start again at the other end because the bridge is continually being painted because it takes so long to get from one end to the other, that by the time they've done that, the first end needs to be repainted. And it's a little bit like that when you're doing research. Things are changing so much that you continue with your research and you come to your conclusion, and then you're aware that actually things are changing again. So you want to go back and get more information. So you're continually, as I have been for the last 11 years, continually researching that particular area and sort of constantly revisiting things. And it's been really fascinating to think back and see how things have changed. The timing of my research obviously coincided with a great deal of interest in terms of concussion, head injury, and the impact this was having on players. In particular, I became aware around about 2009, 2010, that it was possible to diagnose in the brains of human beings, specifically in sports players, where there'd been an element of contact in the sport. It was possible to, after their death, and analyse their brain, to discover that they have some changes in their brain that they believe to have been caused by these head injuries. So this is called a CTE, which stands for chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And that's the idea that actually there's almost a dementia kind of behaviour that can happen from repeated brain injuries. So understanding this as CTE is not new. People have always talked about the term being punch drunk, and talking about some of the problems that people who have been boxers, for example, have as they age with brain injuries. But the title for it of CTE and the awareness of it has caused a massive cultural change. So it was fascinating to be able to be in the research when this was sort of happening and being able to document it. Ice hockey, like many sports, has quite a hypermasculine environment. I was studying a group of professional male athletes who had grown up within this culture of the sport, and for whom it was their entire sort of life and fortune. Vulnerability tended to be criticised. It's quite a hypermasculine environment. Also, sometimes quite high levels of perceived sort of homophobia, sort of sexism or misogyny, and sometimes other kind of sort of criticism such as racism as well. And one of the really interesting things about doing an ethnography is that I was able to capture some of those kind of locker room behaviours where people can banter and joke around, but also able to speak to the players individually in their homes or out for coffee, and sort of be able to delve a little bit more into what they're thinking, what they're talking about. And one of the most fascinating examples from my research during this was that they announced in the National Hockey League, which is in North America, they announced that there would be a 5-point plan for getting rid of head injuries. And one of the players in the locker room said, a 5-point plan, I'll tell you what you can do in 2 points. Keep your head up and man the fuck up. This is a man's game, it's not for pussies. So this quote sort of demonstrates that it was really kind of associated with masculinity, and if you were a hard man, you could take a head hit. But if you weren't able to take it, then you shouldn't be playing, you didn't fit in with that masculine environment. And 24 hours later, I was speaking to the same player in his home, and he actually got very tearful and very kind of concerned about head injuries as it had made the news that week, and said that I'll act out all the bravado, I'll keep it going in the locker room and do it that way, but actually it scares the crap out of me. I'm really concerned about what will happen to my brain. Hockey isn't forever. How do I know what will happen in my future? So this kind of opportunity gives you an example when you do this kind of research of exploring both aspects of the player's behaviour, what they think when they're in a group and what they'll talk about, and actually how they feel about it more in depth as well. So it can be quite hard to unpick the differences that have happened in hockey in 10 years. There have been a lot of changes in terms of fighting in the sport, where it's been largely eradicated. Hockey always allowed fighting in a kind of tacit sort of way, where you were punished by 5 minutes penalty. Both players who engaged in a fist fight were punished with 5 minutes penalty in the sin bin, but actually you need that long to recover from a fight. And because both players are punished, there's no sort of tactical extra man advantage. So it was kind of tolerated because it was seen as being part of the game. That's changed a lot in the last few years. And there's also been changes as well, more sort of wider in society, to acceptance of things like racism, homophobia, violence, misogyny. So it's allowed a much more nuanced kind of acceptance of interest in learning about head trauma and how players can protect themselves from it. It's also been interesting to get a fan perception of this. Fans generally were largely critical when fighting was lowered, sort of less accepted within the league, and tended to move out. They kind of acknowledged that fighting was kind of largely blamed for head injuries, when the sort of science and statistics show you that only 3% of head injuries are caused in hockey are caused by fighting. 97% of those are caused by other contact that you have with other players or with the boards of plexiglass. So there's been an interesting to discover how people preferred to blame the fighters rather than blame the actual contact in the hockey for these head injuries. More recently, since the players that I was observing have begun to retire and move into the second phase of their sort of careers, their next stages and their family lives, there's been a lot of changes in terms of people talking about mental health and suicide awareness. So the biggest killer of adult men, as we know, is suicide. Sport has really picked up on this and offered an opportunity for players who have a great deal of public following and other celebrities as well to talk about this and raise awareness. So in North America, there is a company called Bell, which is a telecommunications company, and they established a hashtag on Twitter called Bell Let's Talk that was really picked up by a lot of sporting communities and tweeted out by athletes with big followings, just to raise awareness one day a year that it's important to be aware of potential problems with concussion and with life in general, on mental health and on suicide. And this leading from the front by athletes has been fascinating to watch, because it is beginning to change the acceptance of head injuries in the sport and concussion, and making people more aware. So the interesting part for me more recently is looking at how players are adapting to these changes, and how those who previously used to play and who know they may be at risk of problems with concussion or head trauma as they age, how they're adapting to it now, how they're considering what the importance is in terms of protecting the head, and trying to challenge some of those sort of problems that we had when we talked about that quote from the player in the locker room, that to be a man, it means you have to take a concussion and you have to play with it and you have to deal with it. Whereas now they can be more aware that it's okay to want to protect your head and to protect your brain and protect your body generally from these kind of behaviours. And so it's been a massively changing period over the sort of 10 years or 11 years of so that I've observed it. So cultural changes are often slow, can be resisted, obviously, but there's a groundswell of behaviour in the last decade to take head injury seriously and to have a more holistic view of players' mental and physical health. And this has involved the challenging of some of the more dominant sort of opinions that have been in the media and with hockey pundits over the years, and challenging those kind of sort of behaviours and opinions, and starting to look at that. One of the ways in which several high-profile players who've been found to have brain injuries or be concerned that they're suffering from injuries has been the way that they're engaging with more holistic treatments in their recovery. So as a criminologist, I'm really interested in the fact that they're moving now to use cannabis and also sort of mushrooms and those kind of behaviours as a way of treating their symptoms that they have of concussion in a more holistic way, albeit in a less legal way, rather than relying on the opioid painkillers that have been overused in sport for the last 10 or 20 years. So that brings another interest to the table for me in terms criminologically of the acceptability of drug use and various legislation changes. So that's just a little bit of an insight into where I'm coming from this, from a cultural, a social, sort of criminological background. It's very much looking at how society and how groups of people adapt to change and adapt to understanding and awareness of head injuries and concussion.
That's really interesting, Victoria, and thank you very much for that. So, I mean, based on what you've said, one of the points that struck me and has been particularly important in my research as well has been that one of the reasons that concussion has not been seen as a big issue, apart from the recent medical developments that have brought it into the light, is the fact that it's not perceived by the participants themselves as being a problem, but simply part of the game. And you talked about the individual that you spoke to. Something else that I came across in my research was very much the mentality, well, it's part of the job. I'm not going to be paid if I don't play, and therefore we should simply keep going. What's the British phrase? Keep smiling and carry on. Is that something that you found as well, that was very prevalent within the sport?
Yes, I believe it was, first of all. Certainly 2009, when I first started studying this, that was very much a case of, you know, you want to play hockey, you'll do whatever it takes. But I believe as sort of science has become more sort of in tune with brain injuries and more aware, public awareness of the impact of head injuries and how we might protect the brains of players, I think it is changing. I think there's less of a accepting it as it is. I think people are beginning to challenge the game for how it is and saying that it's possible to still have a really good game, an interesting game, but change some of the problems that the sport has had. And one of the ways that it's been most prevalent of that is that there's been a history of having a widespread dependence in all sport on opioid painkillers. So players are well aware of playing through pain and just beginning to sort of take that. And during my research, there were several suicides of high-profile ice hockey players in North America who had problems with addiction to these opioid painkillers as well. And And it's become much more aware that actually we're doing quite a lot of harm to these athletes by pumping them full of painkillers and encouraging them to play rather than allowing their bodies to heal. And this is sort of most pronounced really with head injuries and symptoms of concussion. So I think there is a change now, and it's happening in different sports at different times. I think perhaps, you know, one of the sort of slowest to adapt to that may be sports like rugby, where there's sort of acceptance of a history of the sport and how things have been done. But I think times are changing, and I think players are becoming more aware that there's a way to compete in the sport without doing permanent damage to their brains.
Okay, now that's really interesting, and I say that's an essential. It's interesting because there's an essential part there of the Victoria's research, which is very much looking at the problem that exists, elucidating the fact that there is a problem, and looking at how it affects the players and the players' response to that, the fans' response to that. And of course, in any sport, there are so many different constituents who have different interests in the sport, some of which they may not even be aware of themselves. And so that segues nicely to my discussion point, really, which is on the legal approach to this, which is once you've identified that there is a problem that needs to be fixed, a situation that needs to be resolved, how can it be done within the law? Because, of course, just because we all come to the conclusion there is a problem with concussion in sports does not mean that something will automatically be done about it. Either Parliament has to pass a law which says something, which maybe says that that sports must do more to reduce concussion injuries or add specific liability if sports don't do particular things, or the courts have to develop existing case law to say that, much as I said previously, sports must take more responsibility in these areas. And this is where my research really comes in, because I've been looking at 3 specific sports in order to examine whether the law should step in, and if so, how can it best do that? And it has to be stressed that this is not an automatic answer. Just because there is a problem, which clearly there is with players suffering significantly from concussion, does not mean that the law has to step in. There are potentially other ways around it. And Victoria talked about internal disciplinary proceedings, whereby the way ice hockey dealt, in inverted commas, with violence was to punish them with a 5-minute timeout so that they couldn't participate for 5 minutes. That was ice hockey dealing with the matter themselves. As Victoria also said, it's not exactly the most effective method of doing it. And certainly there are existing points, there are existing principles within sports that punish players if they step outside the rules. So, for example, in football, if someone goes up to another player and headbutts them, that in the head, that might potentially lead to a concussive event, a concussion injury, and the player would be disciplined by whoever the governing body in that sport is. There is also the possibility that they would be held accountable in the courts, because headbutting someone on the football pitch is not an acceptable thing to do. However, the question that I've been looking at is whether the sports themselves go far enough. And the one sport I haven't looked at is boxing. And there are many reasons for that, but boxing is in a way too obvious a sport. It is a sport where you go in with a specific intention, which is to knock the other person out or to score more points, depending on the context, by hitting them in a more efficient manner that they are hitting you. The sports I've been looking at are those where concussion is not something that would happen automatically as part of the sport, but something where the inevitable consequences may be concussion. And so the sports I've been looking at are rugby union, where the tackling has become so significant and so aggressive that, mainly because of the developing size of the players, that concussion quite often occurs from it. American football, and quite a lot of the suicide situations that Victoria was talking about, have come out of American football because of the large hits that players have been putting in. And also, and perhaps a little less directly, association football, or as we'd call it, football, as the Americans would call it, soccer. And the fascinating point there is, of course, that tackling in football is normally very much below the head area. And so there shouldn't, you'd have thought, be any issue with concussion in football. But those of you who are more familiar with the 90s, and that's showing my age a little because that's when I was growing up, will remember a very famous player of that time called Alan Shearer. You may now remember him from Match of the Day, where he presents on a weekly basis, or at least he did until the lockdown situation. And he now presents podcasts with Gary Lineker and Ian Wright as a substitute for Match of the Day. But Alan Shearer has been undergoing some research with the University of Glasgow in respect of concussion injuries arising from his sport of football, where it arose from heading the ball repeatedly. And the point was that it isn't just individual significant impact events that can lead to concussion. Multiple small impacts can also lead to concussion. And that's something that Alan Shearer has been looking at, and using his own brain, his own physique as a test in doing surveys through the University of Glasgow. So I've been looking at those three sports and trying to identify, is there a mechanism within the law where it can be said that adjustments have to be made, whether that is by changing the rules, whether that is by increasing player awareness, and whether it is a question of the courts taking a step forward or Parliament. And it is a very interesting question, because Parliament has not typically been that interested in getting involved in sports. The traditional approach by Parliament has been the sports can regulate themselves, players choose to take part in the sports, and because of this, we have other matters that we need to look at. And of course, Parliament has a lot of other business on its plate, looking at all of the matters that it has to regulate within society. And so very often it will be left to the courts. The problem with that is there is no technical method that has been looked at currently by the courts in how to deal with concussion injuries in sports. And that is what I've been examining. And I'm hoping to submit my PhD later this year with a potential proposal for how sporting bodies can be made more responsible for ensuring that players don't suffer as significantly as they have through concussion injuries. And it's very much a question of working out, how can this be done? Is it through the criminal law? Is it through civil law, so an individual suing somebody else? Is it through additional insurance? Is it through strengthening the rules that the individual sports must impose and making players more responsible through banning them from games, for example, if they fail to comply with the more stringent regulations? Is it a question of making the clubs more responsible? Or is it a question that the players themselves get to make the decision? And if that is the case, how aware must they be of the risks? One of the quotes that Alan Shearer gave in a BBC news story about this, when the story came out a couple of years ago, was that he expected to have dodgy knees, but he didn't expect to have a dodgy brain. And I think that that is something that is very important. Most players, when they enter a professional game, wouldn't necessarily expect that to be the case. I'm sorry, that was and that was Alan Shearer in the BBC documentary. They might expect more obvious injuries, but they wouldn't expect their brains to be impacted. And so the question that we'd be looking at from a legal perspective is, how can we do something about that? And so what you've got here is concussion in sports, but looking at it from two very different perspectives. And that is very much the fun part of research. And when you start studying as a law student or a criminology student or a law with criminology student, you get the opportunity to develop your research skills. Your curiosity will be developed as you go through your law school career, and you will have the opportunity to explore in more detail issues that do affect you. And what you'll often find is you'll come across issues that you didn't think affected you, but actually they do. And that is something that hopefully we've looked at today. So, Victoria, is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, I was really interested in what you were saying then about sort of whether you're expecting brain injury. And one of the issues I think that both legal sort of minds and sort of social and cultural kind of investigations can really look at that. And that's sort of, it does hinge on the legal cases with American football, certainly about the leagues knowing about concussion and the impact of that, and withholding that information from players has been quite a large part of it. But also you have to consider the age of people who are consenting. Obviously, when we talk about things like the age of sexual consent, we know what the legal responsibilities are, but quite often when people are going down the path to become athletes and start engaging in this kind of physical contact in sport, that's actually been something that they've done when they've been under the age of adulthood, so when they've been under the age of 18. So we have to then ask the question of whether people can consent to that kind of violence if they don't understand the rules, or they're not of a legal age to kind of comprehend the damage they may be doing to their body. And that's something that was picked up by Matthew then with regards to Alan Shearer, when he's saying he didn't know he would be getting head injuries and the problem with that. And it was also something picked up a little bit, and it should still be available on iPlayer for those of you who are interested, about Shane Williams did a BBC Wales documentary earlier in March, looking at his concerns about whether he's had head injury from playing the sport, and looking into the investigations for that. And you do have to consider the age of people when they start to play the sport, and also what information people have as they go through their careers about what damage they are potentially doing to their body, and whether they consent to that damage, or whether they're unaware of it and have not consented to it.
Absolutely, and I think that is an important aspect. There will be different rules that apply to different categories. So people will have seen that New Zealand has recently made it illegal, or made it against the rules, for rugby tackles, full body contact, full contact tackles in rugby union to be done under a certain age group. And certainly that is something that develops over time, and it may be that is the start of something bigger, and the start of a path along that journey. But anyway, that's all. We've been trying to keep this to around the 35-minute mark to give you a taster of the sort of thing that we would be looking at. And certainly there are modules on law and criminology courses that you can study that would look around these issues. But that hopefully is a taster. Hopefully it's got you interested in law and in criminology and in law with criminology. And hopefully you've enjoyed it. So any final words, Victoria?
Just enjoy using this sort of extra time that you perhaps have at the moment with your school lessons not being in their usual format, just to kind of pique your enthusiasm and your interest. Start thinking about whatever most interests you. I mean, you've got so many opportunities to research, or just read about, or watch documentaries about, and listen to podcasts, just thinking about what kind of things in life really kind of interest you and what you can get enthused about. Because when you're learning, and we'll talk about this as you kind of further your education as well, you learn so much better when there's something you're really passionately enthusiastic about. And that's one of the best things about teaching, from my point of view, and lecturing, is that being able to draw out that kind of enthusiasm from people and being able to support students in studying what they're really interested in. So even if you find that you're struggling in the current times to be engaging in much lessons, just use the time to think and to explore in your own mind just what it is you're particularly interested about, because that enthusiasm for learning is the thing that will get you through whatever you're going to be studying in the future. How about you, Matthew? Do you have any sort of particular pearls of wisdom or last messages to impart?
Only one thing, which is the importance of accuracy. And just to a quick correction, it was actually the University of Stirling in Glasgow rather than the University of Glasgow that Alan Shearer was doing the research in. I'd written down the wrong university. So it's always good to check your facts before you actually put them across, which is something obviously I recommend for your assessments, both at whatever stage you're doing them at. So just a brief pearl of wisdom then, but I absolutely echo what Victoria said, which is make sure that you enjoy the time that you have. It is an uncertain time, but it does give you the opportunity perhaps to look into things that interest you rather than things you are told you have to study, and that is something that to a degree you get to do at university. And so this is an excellent opportunity to start thinking about the wider issues and what impact you want to have on those issues. But apart from that, it's been fantastic talking to you. Hopefully you've enjoyed all the podcasts in this series, and we will sign off. So a quick goodbye from Victoria.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, and it's goodbye from me. Goodbye.